We're almost halfway through the year, and a lot of people are running on empty without fully realizing it. Grow Therapy helps you find care that's covered by insurance before burnout becomes the baseline. Whether it's your first time in therapy or your 50th, Grow makes it easier to find a therapist who fits you, not the other way around. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. And if something comes up, you can cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Grow accepts over 100 insurance plans, including Medicaid in some states. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
Hello, this is international football commentator Derek Ray, and you're listening to the Ranks FC podcast.
Hello, Rank Squad, and welcome to Ranks FC. It's your favourite intercontinental podcast. Well, this week we are keeping things very much based in London. DJ's not here, but I'm Jack Collins, and I'll be your host today. And standing in admirably is a man who you know very, very well on this channel already. It is the wonderful Mr. Dougie Critchley. How you doing, Dukes?
Hello, Jag. Yes, I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me on Ranks. I haven't been on Ranks for a little while. Very excited to be back. I'm good. I'm gearing up for a big weekend because kind of having thought all was done in terms of Sunderland's European hopes, it's now very much back on. But we do still have to beat Chelsea at home. So far from a, foregone conclusion. But it's nice to have something to play for on the final weekend. Unlike Fulham, I imagine you're feeling a little bit sort of like want the season to be done from a Fulham perspective, at least.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's one of those where you're kind of looking at it and being like, that sounds nice to have something.
That would have been fun.
For. I mean, look, we've done it to ourselves, so we have absolutely nobody else to blame. All of the results last weekend went in our favour, and we didn't beat Wolves at Molineux. So, it would have been lovely to go into the final day with something to play for, but unfortunately, not going to be the case. The sooner this is done, I think the better, and we can reset, have a World Cup, and come back next season with potentially renewed optimism and potentially a new manager as well, which is going to be the topic of today's podcast. Not Fulham. We're not going to sit here and talk about the future of Marco Silva, but it has been a big week, Dukes, in terms of managerial changes, in terms of all of the bits and bobs starting to click into gear for next season. So going to pick out 3 managerial changes that we're going to discuss in a bit of detail. This first bit was going to be about the Premier League merry-go-round. But actually, since the start of planning this episode, the news has broken first via Ollie Holt at the Daily Mail that Pep Guardiola was going to be leaving Manchester City after the weekend's game. And then further via David Ornstein at The Athletic that it looks like Enzo Maresca is going to be the man to replace him. A decade for Pep at the helm of Manchester City. It's been an incredibly successful decade, 20 trophies, including 6 Premier Leagues, 4 of which came in a row, which is the first time that has ever happened. Took the club to just the second ever treble achieved by an English side. He's won 5 League Cups. He's won 3 FA Cups. He's won a Club World Cup. He's won a UEFA Super Cup, a couple of Community Shields in there as well for good measure. It has been an incredible era, and it now looks that they're going to replace him with Enzo Maresca, who in many ways makes sense, right? City have moved in silence with a lot of things. You look at their backroom changes, Hugo Viana stepping in for Chiqui Bergerstein, or the fact that they moved their chief financial officer on and someone else just came in who was already doing something else in the business. Barada's role was taken on by people already within the organisation. So you're looking at someone who spent a fair bit of time at Manchester City, twice appointed by them, once as their under-21s, the elite development squad coach, where he led them to the title, and then again as Guardiola's assistant after a first sticky, should we say, managerial spell in charge of Parma. When he left, he got Leicester promoted, and then he took over as champions as well. We should probably say it. First time of asking, joined Chelsea, won the Conference League and the Club World Cup while securing Champions League football. It wasn't always perfect, but it was a positive trajectory. And I think perhaps it looks even better in hindsight, considering what's happened after his exit at Chelsea. I suppose there are a couple of questions. City fans weren't that enamored, I suppose, by the idea when it was first kind of mooted in December, part of Maresca's exit. There is a little bit of a lack of charisma, I think, in terms of talking to the press and talking to different people. He has Pep's intensity, perhaps, but not really his warmth. And perhaps that is different on the training ground. There were definitely a lot of people at Chelsea behind the scenes who were sad to see him go. But I suppose the question is, do you bring in a Pep light to fill in for Pep? How do you go about replacing a manager who, nobody has ever won trophies in the Premier League era at this kind of clip before? Can he be replaced by anyone, let alone a kind of protege of his own making?
Well, it's a very good question, because I think Pep and Man City, it was almost the perfect job. Of course, he had that quite difficult first season, but he needed to revamp that squad. He did that very effectively through massive outlays of cash in his first few years, but very quickly improving players that were there before as well. I think David Silva went to new levels. Sergio Aguero went to new levels. Kevin De Bruyne, who was there before as well, became arguably the best creator in Europe for a couple of seasons, probably alongside Lionel Messi. And look, you're right to reel off his achievements. They won't be matched by the next manager in charge. I don't think anyone could sustain that level of success that Pep did for so long. And he's firmly in that conversation with Sir Alex Ferguson for the Premier League's greatest ever manager. And if he stuck around for another 20 years, there probably wouldn't be any debate whatsoever. I think probably what also damages in that argument is there is that looming 115 charges over his spell at Man City. A lot of that, of course, was before he arrived, but that does slightly dampen his achievements, even though it shouldn't from a managerial perspective. But if the club was built off sort of unfair means and unfair financial shenanigans, then that will, colour his impact for some people. In terms of the Maresca appointment, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously this has been announced as we record this in the midst of a title race. City play Bournemouth tonight. If they drop points, Arsenal will be champions. I don't think it's an appointment that sends a lot of fear through North London, if I'm totally honest. But then I do see the benefit of keeping it in-house with someone that's worked at the club before in both the youth teams and as an assistant manager. But I just feel like if you're Mikel Arteta right now at Arsenal and you're seeing a new manager in Xabi Alonso arrive at Chelsea, who I'm very, very hot on, and a managerial appointment that I didn't necessarily see happening, and we'll get onto that in due course. But if you're seeing Enzo Maresca swapping Chelsea for Man City and Michael Carrick in his first big job at Man United, Arsenal is really opening up for Arsenal to do what Liverpool failed to do last summer and back up their success with a potential another league title if it goes that far and they manage to win this one, which many people expect them to do. So it's not necessarily the appointment that I would have seen coming maybe 18 months ago. But then Enzo Maresca did do a reasonable job at Chelsea in very difficult circumstances. And probably, aside from Thomas Tuchel, who was fired very quick into that Blueco reign, dealt with the chaos of Blueco much more effectively than pretty much every other manager, and had Chelsea fans far more on side than under any other manager since Tuchel as well. So he deserves credit for that. But it's definitely not the sort of appointment that I would have necessarily seen Man City make maybe 2 years ago, if you had to imagine a scenario where Pep was leaving at the end of the 25-26 season. So a little bit of a weird one. And it's not necessarily one that, thrills me or excites me beyond belief.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's quite sensible, but, do you want sensible off the back of it? And look, maybe you'd point to Arne Slot going in at Liverpool and them not making the emotional decision, making the decision that they thought was best, and him winning the title in his first season after the Jurgen Klopp era. Maybe that does point to starting to look at things in a slightly different light and maybe not kind of reaching for the panic button or the emotional button in some ways. But look, I think you make a really good point there about what this looks like. Look, Arsenal are on the verge, as we record this, of their first title in this Arteta era. But it would be only his second trophy in charge of the club, even if they were to go on and win that, which I think many of us now expect them to do. If Enzo Maresca takes over at Manchester City, he's a man who has won things, but not to a severe degree. You'd look at Carrick at United. I'm just going to reel off the Premier League table here. Unai Emery becomes arguably the most decorated manager in the Premier League in terms of what he's achieved over the course of his career. But he doesn't sit in the same generation in my head as a manager as maybe a Pep and Klopp do. I know maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But like, it doesn't kind of sit there. And Villa are financially constrained to a point you'd think that maybe they're not going to challenge for a league title in the next era unless something dramatically changes. Liverpool, we have no idea what's going to happen, but Arne Slot seems to have lost some of the dressing room at the very least and a large proportion of the fan base. But also you kind of go all the way down. Marco Rose is going to be in charge of Bournemouth. Fabian Hertzler's in charge of Brighton. Keith Andrews is in charge of Brentford. Regis de Bries is in charge of your Sunderland. Xabi Alonso is going to be in charge of Chelsea. Eddie Howe's staying at Newcastle. David Moyes, for the time being, remains Everton. We don't know what's going to happen at Fulham, but Marco Silva's options are starting to dry up, is what we'll say. Daniel Farke, we don't know who's going to be there at Palace. Nottingham Forest have Vitor Pereira. Roberto De Zerbi has gone in at Tottenham. And then obviously there's going to be 3 new entries as well. West Ham still could survive as we record this, but that might not be the case by the time you're listening to it. That's quite a young cohort in the Premier League. You actually look at that, David Moyes becomes the kind of elder statesman of this group. And then when you kind of look through the rest of it, it is a bunch of sort of 40, 50, 30 at times with Fabian Hertzler, etc., year olds who feel like a new generation emerging. And, you go back, I don't know, a decade, and people were talking about that era of Pep and Klopp and Conte and a number of other managers who were in there at the same time, Mourinho at United, and saying, wow, this is one of the great all-time Premier League lineups in terms of managers and managerial appointments. This feels like quite a fresh new era in some regards as well.
100%. And I think a lot of that in terms of not just in the Premier League, but the caliber of management around Europe as well does feel quite low at the moment. I mean, look at Real Madrid returning to Jose Mourinho as we record this as well. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that obviously in a couple of weeks' time, we've got a World Cup kicking off and you've got managers of the caliber of Tuchel and Nagelsmann. With England and Germany, you've got Mauricio Pochettino, who would have been probably a banker for a top 8 Premier League job if he wanted one a couple of years ago as well. You've got Jurgen Klopp out of work. Antonio Conte, which is kind of waiting for the next blow up at Napoli. They have now secured Champions League football, but it's never far around the corner. Max Allegri
for the return. He's all going mad.
Exactly. And Max Allegri's never probably got back to that absolute top table that he was at, deservedly so, during his Juventus days as well. And then, I think a lot of the promising young managers that we see in the Premier League are very promising, but there's a lack of sort of gamble being taken on some younger, exciting talents. The fact that we had someone as brave as Vincent Kompany with Burnley, and I'm not necessarily saying that he would have succeeded at a top 8 Premier League job, because I think, it's very different taking over that Bayern squad with the amount of talent that's been departing their rivals this year in the Bundesliga. And look, I think they've been a phenomenal team. They were great in the Champions League. They were knocked out by probably the best side in Europe in PSG. But the fact that no Premier League side was willing to take a gamble on someone with his leadership credentials, his experience level, and kind of a style of play that has worked at the top end of the Premier League as well with Pep Guardiola, probably suggests that there is maybe a little bit of nervousness still amongst sort of CEOs and committees when making these managerial appointments at the top end of the Premier League. So it's an interesting time for sure. I mean, what Pep does next is always fascinating. I mean, so many people have talked about Brazil. So many people have talked about international management. For me, I can imagine him taking a year out, and then I've always imagined him managing at the top end of Italy as well. Maybe he would revamp Inter Milan, probably feel like the best bet going forward. Juventus, probably the biggest club historically, but they feel like a long way off being able to really be at the sharp end of European football once again, whereas Inter had a disappointing year in the Champions League, obviously, but a league and cup double, and do need a refresh at one stage as well. The Brazil job, the Spain job's probably never appealed, given his Catalan roots as well, but you can imagine him maybe taking over the Italian national team. That was something that he was linked with after they failed to qualify for the World Cup for a third successive time as well. And then maybe the PSG job after Luis Enrique. But it's quite a difficult, it's not the most attractive job anymore, PSG, in that, yes, you live in Paris, amazing, you get paid through the absolute teeth, but they've kind of completed football in the last couple of years. It's quite difficult to then build on that. You know, taking over after Jupp Heynckes won a treble with Bayern meant that Pep's Bayern spell never really got the credit it deserved, potentially. Taking over after Luis Enrique, the kind of only way is down, really. I mean, you know, maybe if they don't win the Champions League this year, it's a slightly different story, but still. So where Pep goes next is absolutely fascinating. But either way, as you rightly pointed out at the top of the podcast, you know, what a phenomenal servant. And I'll really miss him as well. I think he's a very unique character, but at his peak, the football his teams played was the best I've ever watched in the Premier League by quite some distance.
Yeah, 100%. And I think in terms of, you know, we talked about it at the top, those things been pulled up in terms of comparisons to Sir Alex, and look, he'll never win that one on longevity. But in terms of the impact that his football had on not just the Premier League, but I think that the English pyramid as a whole, you know, there was so much skepticism around Pep Guardiola and it not working in England and not working in the Premier League, where things were a bit more dynamic perhaps and a little bit more physical. And we've kind of gone through it and be like, well, that did work. They've been the incredible force in so many ways. And look, he's achieved everything I think that there is to achieve. To your point, I wonder if his next move is something slightly more romantic. Like obviously he had a spell in Rome with Roma towards the end of his career. He had a spell in Mexico with Dorados. Like, I don't think he's going to go and take over, I don't know, Club America, but there is something about the idea, I wonder, of him taking over a project that is a little bit more on the outside and be like, can I do something special here? If he took over Roma, and look, he's not going to, they're going to sit with Gasperini next year, and I think he's going to want a year out, whatever kind of comes along here. But if that option was on the table and it was like, okay, can I go in there and do something quite special and bring someone back up to the top table who's been there before? And maybe it isn't in Europe. Maybe he does go abroad. Maybe he does go and kind of manage in South America or somewhere a little bit different. I can see these kind of things appealing to him and being something that he might look at and think, yeah, you know what? That's a new challenge and something that hasn't really been in my world, my remit. Can I achieve any more in the world that I was in? Well, sure, right? You can go and win European titles and go and win Champions Leagues and all of those different elements. But is there something in him that wants maybe a slightly different challenge? I think it would be amazing to see him turn up at, you know, a Roma or, you know, a Betis or a Fiorentina, you know, someone who's not in that conversation, that at the very, very top of their league, and be able to transform a club like that. You know, I think there's a romanticism in that might well just appeal to Pep at this point in his career when he's been so far, you know, far and away the best manager of his generation. I think that's a really incredible place for him to be. With that, I think we're going to take a little breather and we come back on the other side. Let's get to Xabi Alonso, who is now confirmed to be taking over at Chelsea. Stick with us here on Ranks FC. Welcome back to Ranks FC. Jack Collins and Dougie Critchley taking a look at three of the biggest moves in the managerial world on today's episode. We've done Pep Guardiola's impending exit from Manchester City. Let's go to something that is completely confirmed, because on Sunday at the weekend, just a day after losing the FA Cup final to Pep Guardiola, Chelsea confirmed that their manager next season, and manager being the operative word here, not head coach, their manager next season is going to be none other than Xabi Alonso. And I think, Dougie, this is just really interesting on so many different levels, and we can break it down into different parts and all of those elements in a minute. But first and foremost, you said that it was a move that shocked you. We talked about this as a possibility on The Truth a couple of weeks ago, and it wasn't even on your radar. Here we are a couple of weeks later, and suddenly Chelsea have got their man.
Yeah, I've got to eat my humble pie, or my just rename it stupid pie, to be honest, because I totally ruled this out. I just did not think that Xabi Alonso would go to Chelsea in their current position, but I was so wrong. And Sam had it as his dream option for Chelsea. To clarify, I thought he would have been my dream option too, but I just didn't put it in the list because I didn't think it was actually possible. And instead I had Felipe Luis and Cesc Fabregas, but Sam had it at number one. And what do I know? Because, yeah, he's been persuaded of the project. As you say, there's been a retitling of his role there. But I think I find this most fascinating because we can talk, I mean, the cows come home about what it means for Chelsea and their squad next year. And that's very exciting and something we should definitely touch on. But for Xabi Alonso, it is such a fascinating decision because even if that Liverpool job wasn't available this summer, even if there wasn't a project that really, really excited him, you probably almost definitely, in fact, I'm going to change probably to almost definitely, you almost definitely could have ensured that he would have been offered a more stable project at some stage next season or at some stage, in the summer of 2027. So to go to Chelsea now, which effectively rules you out of the Liverpool job, I think comfortably in the short term. I don't think you go from Chelsea to Liverpool as your next move. And that always felt like the go-to move. And then a few days later, and look, for months it's been lined up that Enzo Maresca was Man City's dream successor to Pep Guardiola. But I would, if I was Man City, much rather have appointed Xabi Alonso personally than Enzo Maresca, just because of his, experience at a higher level than Enzo Maresca and his title-winning credentials. Yes, Maresca has won trophies, but of a different style to Xabi Alonso. And he has more experience playing under and working in the microscope that is those top elite jobs. So for Chelsea to manage to persuade Xabi Alonso to take his second kind of risk this early in his career, because no matter what you say about Real Madrid, it is an enormous club, a huge beast to try and get under control. They hadn't had a particularly good season last year. There was a real gap between the players that were kind of aging out and they hadn't really replaced Modric and Kroos and they had a number of injury issues to deal with, but it was a poor year. And so to go in there after Leverkusen, to go right to the top, having slowly managed your way up to that stage and turned down Gladbach when you were at Real Sociedad B, refused any interest, even though there was no firm offer from Liverpool when you were at Leverkusen, to jump right to the top at Real Madrid, get your fingers burnt enormously, whether that's looked a little bit stupid in hindsight in terms of Florentino Perez's decision, but then to take on the beast that is Chelsea. And I say beast, but actually they've been a really bit of a pussycat in the last couple of years. Like there's been no title challenge to speak of. It's a big, big risk from his perspective, as far as I see it, Jack.
So when I was planning this episode, I wrote down a couple of things and I was trying to answer a few questions. The first of which was, why have Chelsea gone for Xabi Alonso, right? And what I kind of came to the conclusion of was dressing room in need of some presence and authority. He has an excellent record in terms of improving and coaching young players. And discipline and culture, two things that have been really lacking at Chelsea, were buzzwords of his time at Leverkusen. There are some Arteta parallels. I suppose they need a long-term figurehead for this project, and we know that they're childhood friends. But that was quite easy. The kind of second part of it was, why has Alonso gone to Chelsea? And I suppose I came up with a few of these as well. The first was that it might seem miles off right now with what we're seeing from Chelsea on the pitch on a weekly basis, but this is still the bones of a very talented squad. They have a lot of players that legitimately need to be coached, right? And wants to be coached at this point in their career, a young, technically gifted core. But then I was thinking about it from the emotional perspective. And actually, I think that this maybe is what digs into what you were just saying there. These are much smaller shoes to fill than Ancelotti's at Real Madrid. He goes in there and the baseline is on the floor, right? From the last 6 months, what we've seen at Chelsea. And you talked about Pep earlier and the only way is down being from Luis Enrique. The only way really is up here, right? For Xabi Alonso. It can't be as bad as it was in the last 6 months. And the other thing that I kind of came to the conclusion of is he has an emotional connection to a number of clubs. Like we've heard him speak about it. We've heard him talk about his love for Real Sociedad. We've heard him talk about his love for Real Madrid, for Bayern Munich, and for Liverpool, perhaps most importantly right here, because this Liverpool job might come up in the summer. I think that they're going to stick with what they've got. I think that they're going to backslot, but it's not a given that that job wasn't going to come up. But he's been burnt by a club that he loved, right? Like he's been burnt in the experience of spending time in a club that he's loved and the dressing room not responding to him in the way that we thought that they would. But I thought that was a silver bullet appointment as much as you could get, in that Xabi Alonso had the aura and the presence at Real Madrid. He was coming from a tactically astute Leverkusen side, and I thought the players would respect him. It didn't work out that way whatsoever. So this is, in some ways, an opportunity to rebuild his reputation somewhere without that emotional connection. And I think that that might be important here. He might be looking at the landscape right now and looking at what's happening at Liverpool. And look, we don't know. All of the reports out of Merseyside suggest that Liverpool never made an approach for Xabi Alonso. They definitely did and spoke to him after Jurgen Klopp left. He didn't think that was the right time to leave. But all of the stories and all of the journalists and all of the reporting suggests that Liverpool are not planning to move on from Arne Slot, whether their fans kind of like it or not. And also, even if they did, that Xabi Alonso might well not be the number one choice from that board and from FSG, who don't really care that he's a former Liverpool player. So he comes into this Chelsea side, which, okay, yes, is on paper in a worse position than Liverpool in terms of league position, but actually in terms of where the side is at, and perhaps he's been given that promise of money to be spent in the summer to shape as he likes. Perhaps he has been given those assurances that he will have more of a say on the transfer structure at the very least. That maybe is an opportunity for him to be like, okay, you know what? I have no emotional connection with Bayer Leverkusen. I went in there and I changed things up and the fans grew to love me because I achieved. Maybe he sees this as a similar issue rather than going in somewhere like Liverpool, as with Real Madrid, where actually the first half of next season could get quite slippy quite quickly if they don't work things out this summer and completely rebalance a side that's felt off for almost the entire campaign.
Yeah, I do see that as well. And also, I suppose, if he's so young in his management career, do you want to tick off 2 of the 3 jobs you've always wanted within your first 5-6 years in top level management when you're only, I just don't know how old he is, 45 maybe max? So I can see why he's taken this gamble, because I do think it's a gamble from a Xabi Alonso perspective. I don't think it's a gamble at all from Chelsea's perspective, given where they are right now and how many managers, 6 permanent managers in the last 4 years. What's kind of fascinating is that a lot of people, as soon as a managerial appointment is made, understandably want to think about how it would work for the current players and what he's paid in the past. And actually, I don't think it's Xabi Alonso did play a 3 at the back at Leverkusen, but he didn't at Real Madrid and he didn't at Real Sociedad B either. So I think this idea that he's bound to play a 5 at the back is maybe a little misplaced. But at the same time, I was talking to a prominent Chelsea fan yesterday, Zach Jalab, my friend Zach Jalab, and he said that, he made the good point that unlike a lot of top 6 clubs, Chelsea have no issue. In fact, they've absolutely loved going to 5 at the back in the past. Under Antonio Conte, they won a Champions League under Tuchel playing at 5 at the back. And it's for those reasons that, if he did go to a 5 at the back, there's a lot of cogs in here that kind of make sense for this system. I think João Pedro leading the line for a 5 at the back with some fluid 10s behind him, that works quite nicely. Maybe getting more players in and around Cole Palmer and a freer role for someone like Reece James to bomb on a little bit and pick up nice spaces behind him. Maybe that would reinvigorate his game. Moses Caicedo, Enzo Fernandez seems like a nice natural duo for a midfield 2 as well. And then, you're looking at some of the centre-backs like Levi Colwill pushing forward like Tapsoba did in the past and Odilon Koscielny on the other side. They probably don't have that Jonathan Tah figure to play the centre of a back 5, but that can be addressed in the summer. And aside from that, with this system and Quenda arriving, it's interesting that they've actually in the last few years had a lot of winger types signed, like natural wide men in Garnacho and Gittins and Neto. That they feel a little bit uncomfortable in this system. But if you kind of get Estevao, Cole Palmer, and João Pedro going in some sort of front 3 system, whether that's Cole Palmer shifting onto the left, which maybe feels a little bit unnatural, then I think it could work quite effectively. And then Cucurella on the left-hand side works pretty nicely as well. Not obviously as technically brilliant as someone like Alejandro Grimaldo, or Alex Grimaldo, but it feels like someone that could cause a lot of havoc going forward and reinvigorate those kind of like Elche days that he had and his kind of attacking purposes from years gone by, where he's turned into a little bit more of a warrior type in the last few years. So in terms of a sort of tactical fit, I like it for this squad. But I suppose the Cole Palmer question's the big one, Jack. Xabi Alonso has had some phenomenal success getting amazing attacking numbers out of attacking players, but also, wing backs in the past. Do you think Cole Palmer kind of has the most to gain from this appointment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally with you on the 3 at the back thing, right? I don't think it's a given, but I think it does quite nicely work with a lot of these players. We've seen Jarell Hato, for example, as that kind of hybrid centre-back, left-back figure. I think he would fit in nicely. Colwill, I think has been brilliant in terms of line-breaking passes through the middle, which is the hallmark of any Alonso system, right? Like he likes central players who get the ball forward. there's a lot there that works for me. I think that Palmer stands to gain a lot. I think he's at a point in his career, Cole Palmer. And we do kind of, I think, forget sometimes how young Cole Palmer still is, 24 years old. But actually, if you look at the way that his career has kind of exploded, he's still just shy, I think, of 100 appearances in the Premier League, which is a weird place to be, right? Like, for someone who feels like they've been around for ages, because he was a bit part player at Manchester City for so long, and then he exploded, and then he's had a couple of on-off years with injuries and form and all of those elements. There's still quite a lot, I think, to come from Cole Palmer. And I think he needs someone to coach the lights out of him at this point in his career. I think he needs someone, and look, where did he thrive perhaps best? I'd argue Maurizio Pochettino and the chaos that came with that attacking setup, with what he was capable of doing in it, giving him the freedom to roam. Well, one of the hallmarks of Xabi Alonso's system at Leverkusen, and look, you can talk about the tactical setup what you like, and whether it's three at the back and whether it's wing backs. I have my concerns about the wing back positions with Chelsea. I think they need to go and get at least one, maybe two more. But if you're kind of looking at it and saying, well, what was the kind of hallmark of the front three? Fluidity for me, right? You had so many different profiles playing in different ways. And yes, Florian Wirtz was the heart of a lot of it. But you had Victor Boniface leading the line sometimes as a target man, and you had him at other times drifting off the side and playing as a number 10. You had Patrick Schick as this kind of aerial ace, with Nathan Teller behind him at times. Frimpong played at times in the front three. Wirtz played in there as well. Amina Adley played in there, who's obviously now at Bournemouth. There were so many different profiles of player that slotted into that front three. And Xabi Alonso likes that controlled chaos at the top of the pitch. I think that there is real scope to see something quite special from that Palmer-Pedro connection, which I think is arguably Chelsea's most extravagant weapon and the thing that they should be dialing into in these next couple of weeks. Next couple of years under Alonso, if they do this, that I think is, for me, where it gets very, very interesting. And if he can unleash that up the top of the pitch, yeah, you can kind of work the rest of it out later, because, we talk about the way that this all sets up. I don't think Reece James could play the role that Jeremy Frimpong played. I think it asks too much of him physically. But do I think he could either play in centre midfield or potentially as a right centre back in this system? Yeah, very possibly, considering his physical profile. I think that you're right in terms of you don't have a Jonathan Tah figure, but Colwill has brought the best out of pretty much everyone he's played with, right? And look, I loved Wesley Fofana before he moved to Chelsea. I thought he was an excellent player. It hasn't worked for him for a variety of different reasons, injuries, and then I think discipline at times as well. But he looks so much better with Colwill alongside him. Could you work that into a back three that made some sense in some regard? I don't know if Cucurella fits for me as a wing back. He's more of an off-ball presence than an on-ball presence. And I think that you need one of those to tilt. You need one side to tilt in that kind of manner if you're going to operate this system. But Kenda played as a wing back under Ruben Amorim at the start of his career. We saw him play that role a fair bit, early on, before we saw Hojbjerg turn this Sporting side into more of a kind of flat team in terms of the back four. But that's definitely something that he will have the capacity to do. And he's a very, very strong runner and a very strong physical presence on that side. If you can make all that work and you can have maybe Esteval into the middle as well, I think Pedro Neto could probably transfer into the middle. I think that, there's going to be more players coming in. We know that Emmanuel Omega is joining. Would he be the different type of forward that they're looking for? But perhaps maybe most importantly, and we can, I don't know if we can talk about perfect signings for Chelsea until we know what he is going to do. And I think maybe because we won't have a game, the signings will kind of dictate what we think the system is going to be rather than the other way round. But if you're kind of examining this from what players or player types are going to struggle here or who's going to succeed, well, my immediate thought is that Xabi Alonso is not going to get burned twice by a dressing room that doesn't respect him. And part of the thing that interests me about the whole manager title as opposed to head coach is actually, is he going to have more of a say on outgoings as much as incomings? Who in this squad is he like, I don't want there. I'm not having this again. I'm not being undermined by player power. This Chelsea dressing room was once a force majeure, right? In terms of player power and what they did for a manager or what they didn't do for a manager. I don't think that's the case anymore. They've down tools at times this year, 100%. But actually, if you look at it, I think that someone coming in with authority and gaining control of that room again might be the most important thing that could happen out of this. And actually, if you're looking for players who might be a little bit worried about what this looks like, the players I would be worried for are those within the Chelsea dressing room who might be agitators, who might have been the ones being like, no, this ain't for me. I'm not going to train today, or whatever that looks like. I don't think he's going to stand for that again after being burned last time.
I think it's a good shout. It's interesting, actually. I remember, I can't remember who was being interviewed. It was someone a little bit unexpected at the start of this season. They pointed to Reece James, and then they pointed to Tosin as one of the leaders of their dressing room. And this is not to dig out Tosin, but it did just go to show that they are really lacking players over a certain age, and Tosin almost by default, because he is that little bit older and has played a fair few more games, assumed the role of leader, when Tosin for me is one of the weaker starting players in this entire 11 and in this squad, and probably shouldn't have had the minutes that he has had at various points under various different managers. And it is just a squad that's crying out for some leadership, because Reece James, I think, is a phenomenal player, but it's not. And, everyone leads in different ways, but he's definitely not a sort of particularly charismatic or violent style leader, let's say. Enzo Fernandez obviously had the racism scandal, was that last summer, which led to key falling outs with the whole French dressing room as well. They've had a number of players arrive and never really been given a run of games to prove themselves, the likes of Disasi and Badiashile, etc. Their chaos in the transfer market has, I think, transcended down to a squad in terms of, does this really matter? I know that I'm here for a long time. I've got another 8 years on my contract. I was signed for £100 million. I can outlast any manager. And I think Xabi Alonso, I agree with you, will go in there and not take any rubbish from any of these guys, because he has achieved more in the game, both as a player and as a manager, than these guys have at Chelsea. And any of them have in their career, aside from Enzo Fernandez probably winning the World Cup. But he was, a part of that team rather than the key member. So, yeah, Xabi Alonso goes in and I think sets his stall out on how standards should be, because I think it's clear that they've drifted for way too long. They can raise themselves for the biggest games, and they did this under Maresca too, but so often they'll just slip to a really messy defeat, which is kind of quickly swept under the rug as, Chelsea are a bit all over the place, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, look, what they've done is gone out and got the best manager on the market, as far as I'm concerned. And that's pre-World Cup, and there might be bigger names later on, but right now, I think they've gone out and got the best name that was available to them, and that's got to be given as a huge, huge compliment to Chelsea. Maybe they have done that period of self-reflection, in inverted commas, that they were talking about after the Rosenia firing, and it's going to be a very interesting summer to see some entrances and exits at Stamford Bridge. Right, we're going to take a little break there. We come back on the other side. We're going to finish this off by talking about the special one returning to Madrid. Jose Mourinho looks like he's back. Welcome back to Ranks FC. Jack Collins and Dougie Critchley alongside you. And we're going there. We're going to the Bernabeu to talk about the mooted return that's been given some serious here we go, should we say, over the last couple of days. That Jose Mourinho is going to be returning as manager at Real Madrid. They're going to activate that contract clause out of Benfica. That means they can get him out for a relatively small amount of money. And he's going to be in charge of that dressing room. A dressing room that has been fundamentally on fire for the last couple of weeks at the start of next year. What do you do when you have a fire, Dougie? Got water? Nah, let's just chuck a couple of kilograms of gasoline into the middle of the mix and see who comes out standing. I mean, look, a couple of questions for you, and look, we'll go through them. But I suppose the big one is, why has Perez decided that this is the moment for Mourinho to return at Real Madrid?
Oh, that is a very good question. I wish I had the answer, because I'm still pretty perplexed by this deal, despite it having rumbled on for weeks now. I think anyone with Mourinho's CV from 2018 to 2026 wouldn't have been in sort of the running for this Real Madrid job. He's obviously got it because he has experience managing super clubs in the past. He did really well at Real Madrid in his first era, despite the constant chaos and the headlines. He was perfect for the Spanish press, who pitched him very aggressively against Pep Guardiola. It was the meeting of styles. It was the meeting of kind of coaches, the up-and-coming manager against the biggest ego in pretty much sport at that particular moment. But this is quite a different Mourinho. He's not arriving with the same standing as when he arrived at Real Madrid last time. He's not arriving to a club that have had a particularly good last couple of years, going trophyless in the 3 major competitions for a second consecutive season. The last time they did that was in 2010, and then they hired Mourinho. I mean, you have very eloquently on The Truth in previous episodes and on other podcasts, no doubt as well, talked about a sort of mixed bag at Benfica, going unbeaten throughout the league season, but still finishing third. I think the best post-Chelsea second stint was probably at Roma, where he won their first trophy in, 14 years with the Conference League, a match you were at. And, there was some real positive signs at various points, but he did spend a lot of money in that first summer and then never finished higher than 6th in the league, was sent off a number of times. That kind of drama followed him to Turkey, where he criticised match officials and the standard of play and pulled the nose of the Galatasaray manager. He then goes to Benfica and defends his player from accusations of racism against Vinicius Jr., whose contract situation rumbles on at Real Madrid. And as you say, there's a fire in Real Madrid's dressing room, and they've thrown an absolute firework into there. I find it very difficult to imagine this being a success, but then maybe I'm not being sort of malleable enough to the idea that Real Madrid right now need a personality more than an elite level manager in 2026, because they've tried the elite level manager, or at least an up and coming to the elite stage with Xabi Alonso, and he got eaten alive by key players in that dressing room. Mourinho won't be eaten alive for sure.
I mean, I suppose that's it, right? Like the players haven't responded to a move to a more tactical, younger coach. They very obviously haven't come back to form with an underqualified vibesman at the helm in Alvaro Arbeloa. So an older head, a disciplinarian, is that what gets them back on side? It's not. A lot of people talking about it and using it as comparison to Carlo Ancelotti. And I can understand where they're coming from, but these are two very, very, very different characters. The cynic in me, Dougie, says that this is a clear out. This is Mourinho going in there to fall out with people so that Florentino can basically get players out of an unbalanced dressing room. Because right now, that it doesn't work, right? We've had Tchouaméni and Valverde fighting in the dressing room. We've had the Mbappe situation with the fans going ballistic about him not being there and flying back and late and all of those things. Arbeloa has clearly lost control of this dressing room in recent weeks. Like, I wonder if he's looking at this and saying, okay, I've made a mistake. There is too many names here. I can't get rid of them just willy-nilly. They're just not going to go. But if they fall out with the manager, then that's a reason for me to go out with him. And so Mourinho can come in with an iron fist in some ways. He feels like the only person that, like, Florentino will back ahead of some of these players. And look, he's no stranger to this. You look back at Iker Casillas, who was San Iker, like an absolute saint of this club, who fell out with him, and ultimately off he went to Porto, and had a couple of brilliant years there before he ended up retired. I think that there might be an element in this. And, there's plenty of Florentino out protests. There's an election going on at the moment now as well at the same time. Part of me just thinks that Mourinho is coming in to be the kind of reset button and effectively to sideline some of these players in a way that maybe Alonso couldn't, in that Arbeloa definitely couldn't. If he sidelines players, they ain't getting back in. Equally, if he decides players are the be-all and end-all, they're going to work for him and they will fight for him, because Mourinho does that really well. I mean, look, to the kind of second point, is Mourinho kind of yesterday's man? Well, his last league title was in 2015 with Chelsea, which is 11 years ago. Since then, obviously, he has won the Carabao and the Europa League with United in 17. And that job, again, another one that looks better in hindsight than perhaps it did at the time. And then the Conference League with Roma in 2022. He has gone unbeaten in 25-26 with Benfica in the Primera, but they also came third. And since he came in, the league table looks, it's the same order as it finished. Benfica played 30 since Mourinho came in, won 20, drawn 10, lost none. They did score 67 goals, though. And it's a bit of a strange one. His Benfica side were quite fun for long spells in a kind of news that maybe shocked some people, because it was Porto with a defensively locked in side. They drew way too many games, but not because they were grinding out 0-0s. They were just a little bit loopy in certain situations. They conceded the most of those three teams. So perhaps a little bit of tough love might actually get something out of this side. My issue with it, I suppose, is that a less controversial Jose is my favourite, Jose Mourinho, which is why I really, really loved his spell in Rome. And look, it wasn't without flashpoints. You remember the referees in the car park and all of those elements. But for the most part, Mourinho was quite calm in Rome. This is not going to be calm This is a defend the club move, in my opinion. And that's a shame, really, because I do genuinely really love the man, especially when he's in that kind of calm mode.
Yeah. I mean, he still got sent off 5 times in Rome. I mean, it's
Yeah, but
a
that's
fair
just Serie
amount.
A, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective about him being kind of the excuse to kind of scalpel the squad and be the kind of scalpel himself. I mean, what's so fascinating is that there seems to be a key division in that dressing room down the lines of who backed Xabi Alonso and who was happy with Xabi Alonso and who wasn't. According to most reports, Mbappe, Tchouaméni, Bellingham really like Xabi Alonso. Fede Valverde, having been played at right back for most of the opening half of the season, didn't like Xabi Alonso. Vinicius Jr. famously didn't like Xabi Alonso. They are, at least 4 of them, probably excluding Tchouaméni, the sort of 4 biggest players in that Real Madrid dressing room. I mean, one of them's the captain. You know, once upon a time, you probably put Alaba and Rudiger there, but they've had so many injury issues. So for their 4 key players to kind of be in dispute openly, one of which having to be hospitalized after a fight, this is a completely unique, situation. I suppose it comes back to what we kind of talked about with the Pep Guardiola replacement and the look to Enzo Maresca, which is all but confirmed, is kind of who else? And once you've been down the Xabi Alonso route, do they want another up and coming manager, someone like an Iraola or someone of that caliber? Probably not. Ruben Amorim obviously kind of ruined his reputation at Man United. Would they turn their attention to someone outside of the traditional elite, someone like Niko Kovac? Probably not. They were the pool of managers to choose from is relatively shallow right now. So they've kind of gone for the safest yet least safe option in Jose Mourinho, who will be able to handle the scale of the club and the scrutiny. It's just what he could manage to do with that dressing room at the same time. When I feel like they do need a little bit more calmness, you've just thrown a firework in there. I just can't see it working out. It depends what your version of working out is. If it's finishing within 5 points of Barcelona next year, going on a Champions League run to the semi-finals, look, maybe it can happen. But is this the side or is this the appointment that in my mind can overturn what has become a little bit of a period of dominance from Hansi Flick's Barcelona, who again have some big recruitment work to do this summer with the announcement that Robert Lewandowski's leaving? I don't think this is the one. I don't think this appointment in 2026 sends any fears into the hearts of those in the new camp. I don't think it even really creates a ripple. I think they'll honestly be laughing at the situation.
I don't know what the name of Hansi Flick's assistant coach is, but I imagine he's going to be getting some eye blockers, after what happened in that touchline brawl. I mean, look, my final question, which you kind of just answered, was could anybody balance this Real Madrid squad and overhaul Barcelona right now? And effectively, my answer to that question was no. Like, I think that this is calculated, potentially even slightly malicious. The dressing room's a complete mismatch, some balance all over the place. I don't think you can sort this out with a manager coming in. If you wanted the closest thing to Carlo Ancelotti that I think is out there as a potential manager this summer, and I've banged this drum for a while, I think the answer was Didier Deschamps, right? Who is an elder statesman of the game, who has achieved at pretty much every level as both a player and a manager, who is coming off the back of an incredibly successful time with the French national team. But I wonder if actually the reason that maybe they've pulled away from that is that it immediately grants kind of leeway to the French players in this squad. And therefore you get Mbappe back on side, you get Tchouaméni back on side. Do you risk isolating the players like Valverde, who I think Mourinho will absolutely adore, right? Like for what it's worth. Like, do you risk isolating them even more? And they can't really afford to lose Fede Valverde, I don't think, at this point, considering how important he is to this team. So, like, maybe that's why they've not gone for that. But I think that option was on the table if they'd wanted to chase it. I think he might have come in here to potentially make them slightly competitive again. Can he restore some pride in the shirt? Maybe. But I effectively don't think there is a silver bullet that would be able to balance this right now, because if you actually look at this, there are issues in the central midfield areas. There are issues up front in terms of the balance. There are issues at both fullback positions. They're going to have to effectively overhaul the defence because Rudiger and Alaba are both effectively broken at this point, Alaba more so. And Ederson Towers to an extent as well, who continues to be plagued by injuries. And it's a real shame because I think he's one of the best defenders in the world. You're going to effectively have to reshape like 4 parts of this squad this summer if you want to make them competitive and balanced. And even then, you're probably going to have to sell some big names. I think that Mourinho might be just the man that can, at the very least, keep the chaos in a box as opposed to let it spill out in the way that it has in recent weeks.
Yeah, well, he's certainly got his excuses lined up. Whenever Mourinho's spell doesn't go quite as well as you maybe expect, he'll point to the situation that he inherited and saying, I took over a club that was at war with itself and the dressing room hadn't won for 2 years. He's got his excuses lined up. I, like you, really value Jose Mourinho. I think he's been an incredible servant to the game, effectively. I think he's created far more drama and storylines, and us in the kind of loosely in the journalism world, we should be kind of grateful to him. I think he's, created some of the best storylines and best football stories of the last 20 years, 30 years. But it just feels so uninspiring in 2026. And the manager that I've always wanted to manage Real Madrid is Jurgen Klopp. Maybe that will happen after Jose Mourinho if he wants to go back into a club of that caliber and under that amount of pressure. But you look around, there's not that many options out there, but I just never foresaw this happening. I really didn't. And I felt stupid for not seeing that Xabi Alonso could take over at Chelsea. But honestly, if you told me that Jose Mourinho would take over at Real Madrid at the end of this season, at the start of it, I would have argued for you to be sectioned. So I'm just flabbergasted by this.
Yeah, I mean, look, I do love Jose Mourinho. I'm always brought to the game. I think he's let himself down quite heavily this year in a moment which might well reflect on what this squad looks like. And as you kind of pointed out before, how Vinicius Jr. reacts to this, considering what went down with Jose Mourinho, the words on the touchline that we never saw what they actually were, the bringing up of Eusebio, the suggestion that trouble follows Vinicius everywhere he goes. I think he really let himself down in that moment, if I'm honest. And actually, it was one of those things where you looked at it and went, 5-10 years ago, I don't think Mourinho does that. 5-10 years ago, I think there's a level of kind of acceptance that something wrong has happened here. And I wonder how that situation pans itself out as well. But it's going to be one of a multitude of storylines that emerge from the Bernabeu this summer. One thing we do know for sure is there's going to be plenty of storylines to look at. And with that, I think we're going to bring this one to a close. So all that's left for me to do is say a massive thank you to Mr. Dougie Critchley.
Thank you very much, Jack. Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure, my friend. There is no truth this week, but there will potentially be an extra little episode on Thursday morning where I look back quickly at the Europa League final and potentially get a word from our friend Sam Tai, who is in Istanbul as we speak, if he is in any fit state to have that conversation. We'll see how we go. I might just ask him for a voice note, but I'll probably try and do something around the Europa League final on Thursday morning to get that out to you guys. And then we'll see you all again next week. Thank you very, very much for listening. We'll see you all very shortly, Rank Squad. Take it easy. Peace.